Before I forget, I want to go ahead and invite everybody here, and especially after you hear David Azerrad, you're probably going to want to spend more time with him. You're all invited to the Fish House tonight for drinks and a little bit more intimate conversation with him at 5 o'clock at the Fish House. So, today we're pleased to have with us David Azerrad, the director of the B. Kenneth Simon Center for Principles at the Heritage Foundation in Washington, D.C. In this role, he teaches core principles of American political tradition to policymakers, political leaders, and the public. Quite a job. He connects those principles to the many challenges facing us today. A popular speaker who hails originally from Montreal, Mr. Azerrad gives talks all around the United States. His topics on modern liberalism and conservatism and the American dream are exceptionally well received. But today, since the Heritage Foundation, the James Madison Institute in Tallahassee, Florida, our friends who are nice enough to bring us speakers once a year, they are celebrating James Madison's birthday, March 1751. And since they've been so kind to bring him to us, he is going to speak today on James Madison, his First Amendment. Mr. Azerrad?
Thank you. Welcome, everyone. I can't tell you how happy I am to be here and speak to the Rotary Club. Oh, can you hear me? I mean, as a foreigner, I'm Canadian, guilty as charged. I mean, this to me is what embodies America. You know, everybody talks about freedom, everybody proclaims their freedom, but Americans have the habits of mind and of character that are befitting free people. And freedom comes to life, not as an abstraction, but in voluntary associations. To me, what sets an American apart from a Swede, a Frenchman, a Canadian is Americans see a problem, and instead of saying, I pay my taxes, let someone else take care of it, the American mindset is, no, let's organize, let's volunteer, let's fundraise, let's do something about it as citizens of a free republic. So I'm absolutely thrilled to be speaking before the Rotary Club. Thank you for having me. The topic that I'm going to talk to you about today is James Madison's First Amendment, which I think is a fine topic. As I'm sure you know, James Madison is not only the father of the Constitution, but also the father of the Bill of Rights. So who better than good old James Madison, arguably the smartest of all the founders, to elucidate for us the precise meaning of the freedoms protected in our cherished First Amendment, especially at a time when one of these freedoms, religious liberty, is under threat. This week, before the Supreme Court is being argued the challenge to the abortifacient mandate in Obamacare. Recently, Catholic charities in the state of Massachusetts, adoption charities, had to shut down. And of course, there was the recent flare-up in Arizona. So it's quite a timely topic. There's only one problem with the topic that I chose, is I don't know which of James Madison's First Amendments to talk to you about. You see, if you look at Madison's involvement in the drafting of the Bill of Rights, you'll find no less than 4 First Amendments that would fit the bill, if you'll pardon the bad unintentional pun. Since I wouldn't want to offend my gracious hosts, and I don't know which of these 4 First Amendments you came to hear about, I thought I'd go through all of them, and hopefully everyone will find something to their choosing. So let's begin with the first one. Madison's First Amendment, which I would call the new preamble to the Constitution. If Madison had had his way entirely, there would have been no Bill of Rights per se. Rather, the amendments that comprise the Bill of Rights would have been woven into the body of the Constitution rather than tacked on at the end. Mr. Madison's First Amendment would have appeared at the very beginning of the Constitution, ahead of the preamble. It would have solemnly announced, quote, that all power is originally vested and consequently derived from the people, that government is instituted and ought to be exercised for the benefit of the people, which consists in the enjoyment of life and liberty, with the right of acquiring and using property, and generally of pursuing and obtaining safety and happiness. That the people have an indubitable, unalienable, and indefeasible right to reform or change their government whenever it be found adverse or inadequate to the purposes of its institution." End quote. By essentially summarizing the foundational principles articulated in the Declaration of Independence, James Madison's First Amendment, if we can even call it that, would have strengthened the connection between our two founding documents. The very strong affirmation of a right to acquire and use property at the beginning of the Constitution, I think would have made it much more difficult for the progressives to launch their frontal assault on property rights to fuel the expansion of government in the 20th century. The main drawback, I think, is, had Madison had his way, is that the Constitution wouldn't sound as nice. I think the line, "all power is originally vested in and consequently derived from the people," just doesn't have the same ring as "we the people." And don't even get me started about trying to pronounce indubitable. I can't even pronounce it. It just doesn't indubitably roll off the tongue. Ultimately, there was a lot of opposition to Madison's proposal to weave the amendments into the body of the text of the Constitution. And the members of the House of Congress wanted to keep the amendments at a strict minimum. So Madison eventually had to concede that it wasn't absolutely necessary to insert these truths at the beginning of the Constitution. And his proposed amendment died in the House, and it only survives in the musty congressional records. Let's look at Madison's second First Amendment, which I would call the 14th Amendment before there ever was a 14th Amendment. By August of 1789, the House of Representatives, of which James Madison was a member, he was in the very first Congress, they had agreed on a set of 17 proposed amendments to the Constitution, which were then promptly dispatched to the Senate. As you know, both houses of Congress, by 2/3 majority, need to approve a proposed amendment before it's shipped off to the states for ratification. Of these 17, the 14th was Madison's darling. He called it the most valuable amendment of the whole list. It's a very short one. Here's what it said. "No state shall infringe the right of trial by jury in criminal cases, nor the rights of conscience, nor the freedom of speech, nor of the press." How is this different? Does anybody see an important difference between this formulation and how the Bill of Rights is constructed?
State versus Congress.
No, who said that?
State versus Congress.
That's it. Our First Amendment says, Congress shall make no law. Ideally, maybe they could have left it at that. I mean, I think the country would have been better off. This one says, no state shall infringe the right. So the First Amendment, as originally written, only applied to Congress. It said nothing about the states. And Madison was very keen on this provision, as he was much more concerned about the states violating religious liberty than he was about the federal government trampling on the rights of conscience. You need to remember that at the time of these debates, in the summer of 1789, there wasn't much of a federal government to speak of. The federal government, or as it was called at the time, and I think should more properly be called the national government, was only a few months old. The Constitution had only gone into effect in March of 1789. Sure, the anti-federalists were concerned that the national government had too much power in theory, but in practice, no one could point to any abuses by the federal government. When it came to violating religious liberty, the bad guys at the time, unlike today, were the states. Madison, like all Americans, knew firsthand about the abuse of religious rights committed by the states. Madison was a Virginian. And in the colony of Virginia that Madison grew up in, there was an official, established religion. Does anybody know what it was? Anglicanism. And for the longest time in Virginia, pretty much everybody was an Anglican. Beginning in the 1750s, though, right around the time of Madison's birth, there was a surge in the number of Baptists in the States. The Baptists were low church Protestants, and the Anglicans were appalled by their disdain for hierarchy and sacraments. They reacted with bullying zeal. Madison grew up witnessing what he would later call that diabolical, hell-conceived principle of persecution. He knew about the Culpeper County Jail, only 30 miles away from Montpelier, where he grew up, where Baptist ministers were imprisoned for preaching their faith. One Baptist minister who had spent some time in that jail recalled, quote, that his Anglican tormentors would get on a table, bench, or something else, stand upon it, and make their water right on my face. Whether Madison knew of this particular incident, we don't know. But we do know that he was concerned and appalled by the persecution of the Baptists, by the established Anglican Church. A church, mind you, that he belonged to. And he therefore developed a profound, lifelong commitment to religious liberty, coupled with a strong hostility and distrust of all state-sponsored religious establishments. As he would later forcefully write in his memorial and remonstrance, the preeminent Madisonian text on religious liberty, I quote, "We hold it for a fundamental and undeniable truth that religion, or the duty which we owe to our Creator, and the manner of discharging it, can be directed only by reason and conviction, not by force or violence. The religion, then, of every man must be left to the conviction and conscience of every man, and it is the right of every man to exercise it as these may dictate." Madison was therefore committed very strongly to his 14th Amendment. Unfortunately for him, the proposed amendment to protect religious liberty from violations by the states died in the Senate, where many things go to die these days, incidentally. In an odd historical twist, though, the amendment that would eventually extend the protections of the First Amendment to people against the states was the 14th Amendment, which was ratified after the Civil War, and it did so in two ways. First of all, by affirming that no state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges and immunities of citizens of the United States. Second, through a series of Supreme Court decisions in the 20th century that essentially incorporated the freedoms of the First Amendment against the state governments. Now, Madison, of course, was long dead by then, but I think he would be pleased to know that his beloved 14th Amendment, his First Amendment, the one that was dearest to his heart, did eventually find its way into the Constitution. Let's look now at Madison's third First Amendment, which I would call the Madisonian First Amendment. On June 8th, 1789, when Representative James Madison of Orange County, Virginia, took to the floor of the House of Representatives to make his case for amending the Constitution, he proceeded to list the proposed amendments, which, remember, if he had his way, would be woven into the body of the text of the Constitution. In between clauses 3 and 4 of Article 1, Section 9 of the Constitution, which for those of you who know their Constitution is one of the 2 mini Bills of Rights that exists in the original Constitution, he suggested inserting 10 clauses. The first 3 I'd like to read for you, as they would essentially later become our First Amendment. They read, "The civil rights of none shall be abridged on account of religious belief or worship, nor shall any national religion be established, nor shall the full and equal rights of conscience be in any manner or on any pretext infringed. The people shall not be deprived or abridged of their right to speak, to write, or to publish their sentiments, and the freedom of the press, as one of the great bulwarks of liberty, shall be inviolable. The people shall not be restrained from peaceably assembling and consulting for their common good, nor from applying to the legislature by petitions or remonstrances for redress of their grievances." End quote. As the amendment moved through the Senate and then the conference committee, they were all merged into one. In the process, the language was considerably weakened. Congress shall make no law prohibiting the free exercise of religion. Just doesn't pack as much punch as full and equal rights of conscience shall not be in any manner or on any pretext infringed. Similarly,
Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of the press, is not as powerful and arousing as the original Madisonian, the freedom of the press, as one of the great bulwarks of liberty, shall be inviolable. What Madison's proposed language does reveal is his unwavering and resolute commitment to the rights of religion, speech, and assembly. And with this, we now turn to Madison's fourth First Amendment, which of course is the First Amendment that we now have in the Constitution. For all the modifications, it's essentially a close cousin. You could maybe call it a non-identical fraternal twin to Madison's original proposition for a set of clauses protecting the rights of conscience, speech, and assembly. It's really comprised of 5 parts. I don't know if you know this, but the First Amendment essentially has 5 clauses. 2 of them deal with religion, 2 of them deal with speech, and 1 of them deals with freedom of assembly. Now, Madison, of course, was committed to all 3 of these freedoms, and to many more for that matter. But if we're going to talk about Madison's First Amendment, that means we're going to talk about religious liberty. Because that was the subject that was closest to his heart and to which he devoted the most attention. He was an unabashed champion of religious liberty and a staunch opponent of anything approximating government involvement in religious matters. Let me explain to you the Madisonian position on religious liberty, basically by looking at the 2 clauses in the First Amendment that deal with religious liberty. The first one, Congress shall make no law prohibiting the free exercise of religion. Let me give you a nice way to illustrate how Madison understood this clause. He picked a fight at the age of 25 with George Mason, who was one of the established big guys in Virginia politics. So we're in the April of 1776, basically almost a year on the dot after the battles of Lexington and Concord. And the Virginia House of Representatives gets together and they decide to petition the Continental Congress to declare independence. And while they're at it, they say, we're going to produce a Declaration of Rights for Virginia. And in good old bureaucratic fashion, what do they set up? A committee, of course. And the brilliant George Madison, he had no patience for what he called some of the useless members in that committee. And he takes a crack at it himself. He does a splendid job. So much so, in fact, that a few months later, when Thomas Jefferson needs to write the American Declaration of Independence, he lifts verbatim several passages from Mason's Declaration of Rights for the state of Virginia. Now Madison, who was half of Mason's age, he strongly objected to one passage that I'm going to read to you. I doubt you'll find it objectionable, but I want you to see what his understanding of religious liberty was. This is what Mason wrote. All men should enjoy the fullest toleration in the exercise of religion. Why would Madison find that objectionable? Any guesses? All men should enjoy the fullest toleration in the exercise of religion. Ladies, I know it doesn't say all women, but at the time when they said all men, they meant all human beings. It's a rhetorical formulation. So that wouldn't be it, that it didn't cover women. Why would he object to that? Any guesses?
Toleration.
What's wrong with toleration? Isn't that a nice thing to have?
Well, if you still come established faith, you just tolerate other people.
That's exactly it. Madison, good American that he was, he didn't think with British monarchical concepts. He thought in American terms. And in America, we don't tolerate religion. Each and every one of us has a God-given, natural, inalienable right to freely worship God as we see fit. In America, we don't tolerate freedom. We're entitled to it. It's our birthright. So Madison had his way, and thanks to him, the final version read and still reads, because you can still see the Virginia Declaration of Rights today. It's at the beginning of the current Constitution of the state of Virginia. This is what it now says. All men are equally entitled to the free exercise of religion according to the dictates of conscience. Let me put it to you this way. Toleration comes and goes, right? The king may decide to tolerate the Jews in England and then change his mind a few months later, a new king comes along, toleration is revoked. When you speak the language of rights, there's no negotiation. This shows you Madison's staunch commitment to religious liberty. That's only one aspect, one half of the First Amendment right. The other half is, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion. Now, this remains one of the most disputed clauses in the Constitution to this day. People strongly disagree on what does and does not constitute a law respecting an establishment of religion. And the Supreme Court's decisions since basically the post-war period have been quite confused on the matter and don't help us make much sense of the clause. So what did Madison think? Let's look again at his memorial and remonstrance. If you have time, it's a 7-page document. It's well worth reading. Like everything else that the founders wrote, it's written in plain, lucid, clear English, and it really sheds light on how Madison understood religious liberty. This is where he lays out his doctrine of what he calls non-cognizance. It's quite simple. Government needs to remain non-cognizant of religion in passing laws and implementing policy. What does that mean? Government has no jurisdiction whatsoever over religion and may not therefore even think of it. It cannot even be cognizant of it. It cannot consider religion in formulating policy. It can consider geography, income level, age, but not religion. Citizens, in their private capacity, are of course free to think and to talk about religion as much as they please. But government is not in the business of saving souls. And just to make sure that it doesn't even come close to it, you essentially forbid it from talking and thinking about it. Let me give you 3 examples. He was obviously opposed to established churches. So in Virginia and elsewhere. So his view was the government has no job whatsoever funding religion. So as president, he vetoed a bill that would have incorporated the Protestant Episcopal Church of Alexandria in Virginia, which at the time was part of DC. When the first census was being conducted in 1790, James Madison at the time was a member of Congress. And he argued that we're allowed to find out what proportion of citizens are engaged in commerce, agriculture, and manufacturing, but we cannot ask whether someone is a religious minister. The government is not allowed to think about these things. When he was president, he refused to issue presidential proclamations declaring national days of prayer and of thanksgiving. Under pressure from Congress during the War of 1812, he buckled. And he did issue 4 of them, but he later acknowledged that in his own view, such measures violated the spirit of the Constitution. This essentially, if I had to sum up in conclusion, is the Madison position on religious liberty. When it comes to your right to practice your religion, he is an absolute staunch defender of the right to freely practice religion as every person sees fit. When it comes to the question of government and religion, he is neither a friend nor a foe. So if you contrast his position with George Washington, for example, Washington thought that the government had a role in promoting non-sectarian religion, in encouraging Americans to acknowledge that there is a higher power, to give thanks to him, never through coercive means, but to talk about it and to promote what Washington called the spirit of religion. Madison didn't agree with that. That said, he would not agree with many people on the secular left today who think that it's the job of government to scrub from the public square every last reference to God, and to ensure that in their public capacities, America never hear the words God or religion. In short, unrestricted free exercise of religion in the private realm, and a government that neither promotes nor suppresses religion. I would like to end on a strong Madisonian note that goes well beyond the First Amendment, and then I can take some questions. Our religious belief, our conscience, our ideas, our voice, all of these we cherish. But what guards them? In part, the First Amendment. But Madison was too smart to expect a piece of paper to do the hard and relentless job of protecting freedom. In fact, he repeatedly warned Americans against putting their trust in what he called mere parchment barriers. So what ultimately protects these freedoms? I'll leave you with what is, in my opinion, the greatest passage in all the Federalist Papers. It's a line from Federalist 57 that Madison penned, and he's taking up the question, what is going to prevent Congress from passing laws that don't apply to itself? His answer applies to this narrow question, but it applies to every issue that matters to citizens. He says, I answer, the genius of the whole system, the nature of just and constitutional laws, and above all, the vigilant and manly spirit which actuates the people of America, a spirit which nourishes freedom and in return is nourished by it. Citizens, follow in the spirit of James Madison and remain jealous of your liberties and on guard against anyone who would take them away from you. Thank you. Sure, of course.
So how come our founders, do you think, worded the First Amendment and the Second Amendment so very differently? Where the first one just is very specific about Congress passing laws, where the second one says shall not be infringed. And then why is that kind of ignored?
So the question is, why is the Second Amendment worded differently than the First Amendment? I suspect part of what you're getting at is the argument that people on the left today make to take away our guns, that it was only meant for militias and you don't really have an individual right to liberty. Look, the founders were humans. They were living in the 18th century. They articulated principles that I think are timeless and true, but I think it is too much to ask of them to anticipate modern liberalism. Let me give you an example. One of the things that they were obsessed with was freedom of the press, which isn't that big of a deal today in the US, right? I mean, that's kind of one of these issues that they wrote so much about. That wasn't a threat coming from a monarchical background that today has pretty much been settled. On the issue of guns, it never crossed anybody's mind that a free citizen wouldn't have the right to protect himself and his family. Therefore, they didn't word it maybe in terms that are most useful to us for the battles we're fighting today. But that's only because it never even crossed their mind that someone would come along and say that in a free republic, the citizens are to be disarmed. So, the principles are true. Some of the rhetorical formulation maybe is not as helpful as we would need them to be today, but that's not a failing on behalf of the founders, is they couldn't anticipate what would happen 150 years later. Yes, sir?
Having just last week been in Orange County, Virginia, but my issue is much what you were speaking to, much more like George Washington and the understanding of it. Under his own situation, I agree. I don't think if he were here today, he would see there's any issue with religion the way he would look at it in being in that time period to where we are today. But just as you said, well, he takes this stance on various other things that may be his stance, as you say, but that's not the American stance, because by the very own Constitution, it has to be interpreted. It is not a monarchy. It is interpreted by what happens and by what generations do going on, not what one individual says, this is what I meant. So again, these people who say there's not supposed to be any religion, I do not agree with that at all. There's nothing in that document that says there should be no religion whatsoever.
So that's an excellent point. Let me branch out on it a little bit more. By and large, when you look at the big questions, the important foundational core principles, the founders disagreed about all sorts of issues. I mean, as you may know, Hamilton and Jefferson were at each other's throats over the National Bank and so on and so forth. But by and large, these are kind of policy questions. On the core foundational principles, you find broad agreement, except on a few issues. And this is one of them. So if you look at the issue of what is the government's job in promoting religion, there is a Jeffersonian position, a Washingtonian position, and a Madisonian position. And they don't exactly agree. What you will not find is anything resembling the position, say, of the Supreme Court in the past 50 years, or the view put forward by the ACLU. So even Jefferson, in that famous letter to the Danbury Baptists, where he speaks of a wall of religion, a wall separating church and state, it doesn't mean what people claim it means today. So There is no unanimous agreement amongst the founders on this one issue, but you will not find a precedent for the view that in America the public square ought to be devoid of any references to God, and that people somehow have a right to not hear any religious opinions outside of the church. There's no precedent amongst the founders, although they disagreed about how far government should go.
I would agree with you with that, totally.
Yeah. But it really is one of the few exceptions. I mean, by and large, one of the interesting things you see with the founders is really broad agreement over the idea of natural rights, government by consent. The anchoring ideas articulated in that second paragraph of the Declaration of Independence.